of us, and she's a dear friend. With her are her two daughters, and she does have some guests, but I really don't know who they are. She'll probably introduce them. Her daughters are going to be taping this for her son who lives in London. Please give her your attention, because it's a serious subject and it's not easy. She's not a public speaker, but she's going to do it for us. At the end, she'll have a question and answer. And so, here's to you, Issa.
Morning, everybody. My name is Issa Seelig, and I'm a Holocaust survivor. Some of you already know my story, and others have read our books that my very special and talented daughters researched, put together, edited, printed, and spent nearly a year working on it. And that's my cousin Sid, who came all the way from Westview to be here. And that's our friend Mary. I was born in 1932 in Kovno, Lithuania, of a religious Jewish family. My father was a graduate of a Russian university and spoke German, Russian, and Lithuanian. My mother was a graduate of high school and went to finishing school in Germany. We lived in Kovno until my grandfather died, and then we moved to Tauroggen, which was a smaller town, to be with my grandmother. My father owned a bristle factory where they produced bristle that was used for cleaning ammunition in those days, and brushes, because there was no nylon. Then we had sawmill and forests and many other things. And we lived there, and it was a pretty good life. There was very little anti-Semitism amongst the Lithuanians, and there were many Jews that did very well there. In 1937, my little brother was born. He was 5 years younger than me. In 30...
Keep the microphone up.
Okay. Then the Russians came into Lithuania in 1940. They occupied Lithuania for a little while. They took away most of the belongings, except individual residence that people had. And that was not only from the Jews, but those were from Lithuanian rich people as well, and sent them to labor camps in Russia. My uncle and some of our cousins went to the labor camps in Russia, and they spent the war years there. My uncle didn't survive, but the cousins did survive and came out of Russia later on. We were supposed to have been sent out as well, but there was no more time. So, because the Germans came in 1941. And while the Russians were there, they stationed officers in our house as well. And the Russians really weren't used to very luxurious lives. And when my father opened a bottle of wine for them, they made him drink the first glass to make sure that the wine wasn't poisoned. And when they walked into my parents' bedroom, they wanted to know how many people slept in the bed. So, but that was only for about shortly over a year. And then the Russians left and the Germans came in. And at that time, my parents decided that we needed to go back to Kovno, where there was a larger Jewish community, because we had already heard what was going on in Poland before the Germans came into Lithuania. So I do not remember how we actually got from Tauroggen to Kovno. It's not that far, but I have no idea because our cars were already taken away and everything. So, but we made it to Kovno, and there they congregated all the smaller Jewish communities from different areas into a ghetto. I remember that we lived in a few houses while we were in the ghetto, and they got progressively worse because they kept on taking more and more people out of the ghetto. They said it was labor camps, but it wasn't. They took them out and shot them and killed them. So we stayed in one house that was the first one, and that was a really nice house. And the Germans came and took everything that we had, and they said in the end, well, now you can wash the walls top to bottom and up again. And somebody had hidden some things that people tried to hide, jewelry and everything, and they had hidden some money in a stove, and somebody else didn't know, and said, fire. The money burned. And from there we were moved to a smaller house, and there my father had two brothers and two sisters, and my mother only had one brother. And my one uncle and grandmother came to live with us as well, and she was really very old and didn't know what was going on. So I remember her sitting in a chair in the sun, and we children used to sort of play around her. And in that house, my father hid some diamonds and some other jewelry in a wooden ledge or something. So I'm just mentioning that because that has some consequences later on. So he tried to hide all that, and we left it there. And from there, we moved to even worse accommodation because they made this ghetto smaller and smaller as we went along, and in that one there were a few families in one room, and there was no running water or bathroom or anything like that, so you had to go out or bring in a tub, and the whole family used to bath once in a while in one tub. They had in 1941, they had what was called then the Große Aktion, where they halved the ghetto nearly in half of population, where they had people going to the right and people going to the left. And after a little while, everybody realized what was happening, that going to the left was more or less going to death, while going to the right was to live. We were sent to the left because we were a family of one man and two women and two children. But some of the people who knew my father saw it and managed to get us back over to the right. After the action was finished, the ghetto was more or less half the size to what it had been before. The men were sent out to work outside the ghetto on an airstrip, and they were sometimes able to bring in some food for us. If they had been caught, they most probably would have been shot. The women worked in a factory inside the ghetto and made uniforms for the soldiers. And the children played. There wasn't very much school. Now and again there were some lessons, but the education was really very non-existent. Poor. And there are many, many stories. I can go on and on, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to hit the high points of things. In 1944, they had what was called the Kinderaktion. That means the children they took away. And they did that during the day while the parents were at work. They took 1,800 old people and children. The German soldiers came and took them. And my grandmother was with us, and she and my brother and myself hid in the loft, and neighbors helped us. But the Germans spoke with the bayonets and they found us. So they took my grandmother and my brother away, and I wanted to go with them, but my grandmother wouldn't let me. She pushed me away, and said, no, you stay, because I think she might have realized what was happening, you know. So when my parents came home that evening, it was just me left. And shortly after that, the ghetto was then dissolved, because the Russians were starting to come back again into the area. And we were put in first into barracks, what was left of the population, and then into cattle trains. And there was no food, there was no water, there was a bucket in the corner with a blanket around to use as a toilet. And we spent a few days in those cattle trains. And then when they got to Germany, they took out the men and sent them to Dachau concentration camp. And we went further on into the Polish corridor into Germany, and we went to another camp that was called Stutthof. Those were the women and children by then only. Anyway, when we got there, we were put into a whole room, a barrack or whatever, and told to undress and get into the shower, which everybody did, of course, and then when one came out, there was a heap of clothes and shoes, and everybody just picked whatever they could and got dressed. We stayed there a while. I really don't know how long, and today I'm sorry I didn't ask my mother more at the time. And then they started asking for people to go to labor camps out of the concentration camp. And my mother decided that it was safer to go to a labor camp than to actually stay behind. So she volunteered or whatever that she and I would go. We had another cousin there, and she decided to stay, and she didn't make it. So then we went to a labor camp, and we got to dig ditches for the German soldiers. They thought that the German soldiers might need it for escaping. So for quite a long time, it was very cold, and we lived in barracks that had shelves and straw on them, and we each got a blanket and a coat. There was no water running, there was just one tap outside where you could wash your hands or your face. I don't ever remember having another shower after that first one. And it was really, really cold, and of course there was no food. We used to get watery soup that was made from potato peels and some bread, and I'm sure my mother gave me her bread, I have no doubt about it. And the worst of it really was that we all smelled, which of course we couldn't smell each other, so it didn't matter so much. But the lice, we were lice infested. And that was really the worst. That's the worst thing that sticks in my mind. Lice on everything and everybody, you know. And so that we lived there until one day the Russians came and liberated us. The German, the German guards only had old people and children guarding us, really, because the men were fighting in the war, so they really didn't have very many soldiers or young people left there. So one day, one of these young guys, and he sometimes gave me some food, and he didn't have very much either, but he had dysentery, and he only had one pair of pants. So he came to guard us with a blanket round his middle. You know, people still had a sense of humor. I think they realized either we make it or we don't make it, and we have no control of what was really going on. But while we dug the ditches, we did hear the Allied planes coming over. And we really feel that they never bombed us or shot at us, that they must have known that it was prisoners of war that were down in the ditches and not just German soldiers. So, and then one night the Germans were gone, and the next day the Russians came. So we were liberated by the Russians. And I think in one way we were lucky that the Russians didn't have much food either, because what they gave us didn't kill us. While other camps that were liberated by Westerns, they dished out good food, and it killed the people because they weren't used to eating. So Anyway, from there, my mother decided that we needed to go back to Lithuania, because at that stage they had arranged that the family would meet back there. And we didn't know who was alive or who had survived or who hadn't. As it happened, my mother and I were most probably the only two people that survived out of a very large family. We had lots of cousins and aunts and uncles. My grandparents had lots of cousins, lots of brothers and sisters, and as I said, my father had his one brother and wife and daughter were killed in Riga, Estonia, and another one managed to get out. They were in Switzerland when the war started, and they didn't go back. They went to Israel and stayed. At the time it was called Palestine. The others were all killed, and my uncle, my mother's brother, died in the labor camp in Russia. So he didn't come back, and then we heard that my father hadn't survived. So we knew that, and my mother said, well, it's time for us to try and get out. We don't want to stay here. So she went back to where the ghetto was, and she remembered that the jewelry and everything was hidden there. So she managed to find 2 of her earrings that were in one place, and some of the jewelry in another place. Well, the other jewelry somebody either found or took, but she did find the 2 diamond earrings, and I still have one of them set in a ring. The other one really saved our lives because she sold it and she bought a passport. You know, people organize those sort of things, and she fictitiously married somebody who came from Poland and had a Polish passport, whose wife had been killed in the war, and he had a daughter as well. So with that money, my mother managed to pay for the trip for all of us to get into Poland. And I don't know what happened to the gentleman. I mean, it was just a fictitious marriage. And from Poland, there were already starting to be Jewish organizations. A lot of them were connected with America, with the UNRWA and Joint and all these big organizations. Excuse me. And they smuggled us across the border to Austria by walking at night and hiding during the day. I don't know how long it took us. I just have no idea, no concept. But in those days, Austria was a 4-zone city, just like Berlin. Vienna was a 4-zone city, just like Berlin. So in Austria, we were already free, because that is when we were in the American zone. So from there, we were transported to a DP camp to Munich. Just outside of Munich, there was a large DP camp, and what to dispose people that they were collecting and see, you know, what was going to happen next. And that was okay, you know, people started to recover again a bit, and people came from all different parts that had survived. And we met a cousin of my father's who lived, he had survived the camp as well, and the rest of his family hadn't. And he took us in a way, and we lived in Munich with him for quite a while. He was a very nice man, wanted to marry my mother, but my mother didn't want to do that. So we stayed with him until, we were liberated in 45, and we went to Germany in 46 and stayed there till 49. And that's when I started to get some education again. There were schools that were established for the children and some private teachers. So, you know, most of us started to catch up. It wasn't a very extensive education, but it was mainly history and geography and literature, sort of more classical, but not much in math or science. And from there, my mother decided that we needed to go to England, because when my father was in England the last time, he had left a lot of bristles. He did business with England, Switzerland, and Germany, and he had left a lot of bristles and other money there, and he took out his gold watch and gold cigarette case and gave it to a friend whom he had saved from Russia years ago and had gone to England. So, as I'm sure you all know, England was very badly blitzed and bombed during the war, and a lot of the banks were bombed, so a lot of the papers and things were destroyed. So when my mother met up with this gentleman, he said, well, my father didn't leave anything, he doesn't know anything, but he said, here's your gold cigarette case and your gold watch, which my son now has. And that was it. We had no proof of anything because all the papers, we couldn't find anything in the bank because there were no papers left, so that was the end of that. So we had cousins in England who were really very, very good. We had a lot of family all over the world. From my grandfather's side, there were people in Canada, America, and England. From my grandmother's side, most of them went to South Africa. So the cousins that were living in England managed to get us papers to go from Germany to England. So we spent a few years living in England, and when our relatives from South Africa came to visit, they said, and life was pretty hard in England still in those days. Everything was on ration, and there was a lot of black market if you had the money, but for ordinary people things were pretty, I think there were longer rations than there were in Germany actually. And so when our relatives from South Africa came, they said, why don't you come to South Africa? South Africa is a beautiful country, it's warm, it's lots of sunshine, things are cheap, there's plenty food. So my mother said, okay, why don't we go to South Africa? So we did. In 52, we immigrated to South Africa, and it was a beautiful country then. And that's where I met my husband, and we married in 54. My husband was a law student when I married him, and he graduated from law school, and then we married and lived in South Africa, where all three of my children were born. And I would like to say that I have a wonderful son and daughter-in-law in London, Leonard and Erory Seelig, and I love you guys. And now, I don't know, I've just hit the highlights. If you have any questions, please ask them. Otherwise, I could go on with many stories for a very long time.
When did you move to the U.S.?
To the U.S. we moved in 1980. My husband passed away in California, and my son was at A&M, and that's how we actually came to be in Texas. And my one daughter was still working in Germany at the time because she had been in finishing school and hotel school in Switzerland. So we sort of slowly, and the other one came here to finish. She finished high school at Clear Lake, my youngest one. So that's how we sort of drifted, and that's we stayed.
It's kind of ironic that the Russians did you bad in the beginning, and then they let you go at the end. Isn't that strange?
Well, you mean after the war that they let us out?
Yeah.
Well, it was only because my mother met this man who had a Polish passport with a Lithuanian passport. I don't think we could have gotten out.
No, what I meant was when they came, the Russians came to the concentration camp
Mm-hmm.
and freed you all. After they had started out in Lithuania and they had taken all of your belongings and everything.
Well, that was a different period because by then the Russians were already on the same side of the Allies. They were fighting.
But isn't that ironic?
Yeah. And they were fighting the Germans as well.
How old were you when you were big and dangerous?
I was 9. I was born in 1932. And so,
How did you go over a mountain when you were a little
Many things I don't know, but you do what you have to do, and I suppose you just did it. Because if you didn't do it, you would get shot. I only speak German and English, but my parents both spoke Russian, German, and Lithuanian, and Yiddish, which is a sort of Jewish language that they spoke. It's similar to German. Yes.
My cousins were in Germany. My family was from Germany.
Yes.
My mother and father were born over there. But then a lot of them were in concentration camps too.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The Germans, anybody that was mentally retarded or physically handicapped or was against the Nazis, very much so. They too. But, and of course, the German men died because they did. They went to fight in Russia in winter without clothes, without food. They didn't remember Napoleon. If they'd remembered him, they might not have done that. So, no, yes, sir.
Issa, I want to thank you for your story.
Oh, thank you.
I'm Jerry Gaffney, my wife Sheila, are friends of Mary's who invited us to come today.
Oh, hi.
I am a first generation American citizen. I am the last of my family from Poland, of which there was a huge number in our family. I'm lucky I have 2 sons to carry the name, but out of many, many people, I was the last one.
Are you Jewish?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
I have heard hundreds and hundreds of stories,
Absolutely.
and now your story will be added to that. It is not an easy subject to talk about.
No.
Public speaking or otherwise. And I have known a number of survivors. I know how difficult it is, and that's why I thank you for making the effort to explain your story.
No, thank
I
you.
appreciate that so much.
Well, with me, it's sort of locked in a safe deposit box in there, and it doesn't get opened very often because I did not want to live my life back then. I was lucky enough to be young enough to marry, to have 3 wonderful children. I wanted my children to have a happy childhood, not feel any different to anybody, to other children in South Africa, and I think they did. And I'm not a person that hates people, and I definitely don't blame the younger generation of Germans for the deeds of their fathers. And I've had many German friends over the years that were my age that had nothing to do with the Nazis. And I have traveled in Germany as well. So I don't live my life hating anybody. I think hating is a very destructive emotion. Yes?
We need to hear it because it can happen again.
Yeah, yeah. It's rather frightening that we're coming to a circle where things might start again. Yeah, sorry.
Lisa, I went to Holocaust Museum in Naples, Florida, and we had a tour guide who took us around.
Yes.
And all the time he spoke, he was so angry. And you came out of there just feeling shattered. But you're speaking with something, it just gives us feelings of compassion and sorrow for what happened. And I think that's the way it should be. And I thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, when I watch the news and I see some of the news stories about the children not having enough food, and no place to go and no place to live, believe me, I relate to them. Believe me, I feel terrible when I see that.
Separated from your parents.
Separate from their parents, or even like in, we have actually the Holocaust Museum here is rebuilding.
Yeah.
That might be a good trip.
And they will have bigger facilities they're opening up. But I spoke to a friend of mine who's very involved in the museum and has even spoken in front of the United Nations. And she told me that genocide by the United Nations, Rwanda, Cambodia, and Bosnia are the 3 genocide places now that are officially designated by the United Nations. So, and that was way after the Holocaust. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
Would you tell us a little bit what happened to your mother? Did she go?
You mean afterwards? Yes. My mother was a very strong person, and if it hadn't been for her, I wouldn't be here today. Because, she wouldn't have had anybody to live for, and I wouldn't have had anybody to protect me. And she was a very strong person. And she never remarried, but she had a good life in South Africa with my children. And she was very involved in their lives, reading and playing with them and doing everything. And there was a very large family in South Africa as well, because all the great uncles that had immigrated to South Africa left before the turn of the century, because the Russians were trying to take all the men into the military, and they didn't want to join the Russian military, so they immigrated to South Africa. So there was a large family, and they were very good to us and to my mother. And actually my mother came to this country, and she died here in '87 and is buried in Dallas. So, and I must say one other thing. With all the bad things that the Germans did, after the war, they did pay compensation to a lot of the people. And if it hadn't been for that, very many of the older people would not have known how to live. And my mother got a comfortable pension to live on from Germany. I'm sorry, you wanted to ask some?
She was wanting to know when your mother passed away.
Oh, okay. Yes, no, she was here with us as well. So, well, if there's nothing else, then I would first of all like to thank you all for coming. And then I would like to read to you a thought, a quote, poem, whatever you want to call it. And I'm going to read it verbatim. It was written by Martin Niemöller, a Lutheran minister. In the early days of the Nazis, he supported them. And then when he saw what was happening, he didn't, and he was arrested and imprisoned. And he wrote, "First they came for the socialist, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me.